Have you ever walked into a perfectly quiet room, looked at two people smiling, and instantly known they were fighting before you arrived? Most people call that intuition. They call it a superpower. But if you actually live with this kind of hyper-awareness, you know the exhausting truth. Your brain does not have an off switch. Today, we are looking at the psychology of the hypervigilant mind. We are going to uncover whether you were born with this or if your childhood forced you to develop it. And most importantly, I'm going to show you the 3 psychological shifts you must make to stop your own awareness from swallowing you alive. Shift number 2 is usually the hardest to accept. To understand why you see and feel so much more than others, we have to go back to the very beginning. Psychology divides overly aware people into 2 distinct origin groups, and knowing which one shaped you changes everything about how you understand yourself. The first group is born this way. Science identifies them as highly sensitive persons. From the moment they enter the world, their nervous system is fundamentally different. It is not damaged and it is not defective. It is simply tuned to receive more. Where most brains filter out background information to avoid overwhelm, the highly sensitive brain takes it all in. Subtle changes in tone, the emotional atmosphere of a room, the tiny micro-expressions that flash across a face and disappear in a fraction of a second. For them, life is always played in extreme high resolution. This is not something they learned or practiced. It is their factory setting. But the second group was not born with this. They were made, and their story is often one that is harder to tell because it starts in silence. It starts in childhood in spaces that should have been safe but were not. Neuroscience calls this acquired state hypervigilance. And it almost always takes root in an emotionally unpredictable environment. Picture a child growing up in a home where the emotional climate could shift without warning. One evening, everything is calm. The next morning, there is tension simmering beneath every word. Maybe it was anger or grief or the quiet desperation of adults who were struggling to hold their own lives together. That child could not rely on things being okay. They had to learn to scan for danger before it arrived. They became a tiny meteorologist of human emotion, reading the atmosphere constantly to predict storms. Some of these children learned to identify the exact sound of their father's car pulling into the driveway. They knew from the way the engine cut off whether the night would be peaceful or terrifying. Others memorized the specific rhythm of footsteps in the hallway, understanding instantly what mood was approaching the door. Biologically, the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for detecting threats, was being activated over and over again. And with each activation, a deep message was being recorded. This environment is not reliably safe. You must stay alert. Your survival may depend on noticing what others miss. This kind of adaptation is brilliant in its own way. It gave that child a kind of fluency in human emotion that most adults never develop. But here is the cost. That vigilance does not simply disappear when the environment changes. Even when that child grows up and moves into healthy relationships and stable homes, the internal radar keeps running. The survival software never got uninstalled, and over time, this constant scanning hardens into identity. You look at yourself and wonder why you cannot just relax like everyone else. You assume something must be wrong with you, but nothing is wrong. You are simply carrying an ancient shield that fused to your skin, a shield that once protected you but now weighs heavier than any threat it was meant to defend against. When that massive awareness enters everyday adult life, it shows up in unmistakable patterns. Pattern number 1 is the silent killer, the perpetual analysis loop. For most people, a conversation is simply a conversation. Words are exchanged, meaning is conveyed, and then the moment passes. But for your brain, every social interaction is a multidimensional data stream that never stops flowing. And your brain is not a passive receiver. It is an active analyst, constantly interpreting and cross-referencing and predicting. Let's look at a real-world example. It is 4 p.m. on a Thursday. Your boss sends a message. Let's chat when you have a minute. For a typical employee, that is just a calendar item. But for you, a 3-second cascade of absolute chaos is triggered. You notice the lack of an exclamation mark. You notice that the boss usually says quick sync, but this time said chat. You replay the last 48 hours of work in your mind, scanning for errors. Before you have even replied sure, your body is already carrying a low hum of anxiety. If you have ever had your brain turn a simple text message into a psychological emergency, drop a 1 in the comments right now. I read them, and it genuinely helps to know we aren't crazy. Pattern number 2 is where it gets truly exhausting. Hyperself-Surveillance. If the analytical camera of your mind only pointed outward, it would be draining enough. But it also points inward. Psychologists call this metacognition. It is the capacity to think about your own thinking. Everyone has this ability to some degree, but for you, this function is dialed up to a level that rarely ever rests. You do not just feel an emotion. You observe yourself feeling it. You do not just think a thought. You analyze the thought while it is still forming, and then you judge both. A sudden wave of emptiness washes over you for no obvious reason. A non-overly aware person might simply feel it, let it pass through, and move on. But your mind immediately steps in. Why am I feeling this? Is this sadness legitimate? I have a job and I have people who care about me. I have no right to feel empty. What is wrong with me? And just like that, the primary emotion gets buried under a secondary avalanche of self-criticism. This is the mind caught in a loop of perpetual self-surveillance. It is like trying to dance while staring into a mirror, adjusting every movement before it is even complete. You might technically execute every step correctly, but you lose the music. You lose the spontaneity. You lose the simple, unexamined experience of being alive in your own body. And over time, this creates a strange kind of loneliness. Not loneliness from others, but loneliness from yourself. When that self-monitoring lens stays on for years, it fundamentally alters your relationships. Which brings us to pattern number 3, the loss of relational innocence. Deep awareness gives you a backstage pass to human behavior. You begin to perceive the mechanics behind the performance. You see that people do not always say what they mean. That kindness sometimes comes wrapped around a hidden request. That affection can be a subtle transaction. Psychologists refer to the ability to infer others' mental states as theory of mind. But in your brain, it becomes so acute that it erodes something fundamental. The capacity to simply trust the surface. A coworker brings you coffee and praises your recent project. Instead of letting the warmth land, your brain instantly scans for subtext. What are they about to ask me for? Is this genuine appreciation or professional maneuvering? You are not angry. You are not bitter. You are just incapable of ignoring the gap between words and probable intent. When you can see the scaffolding behind every social gesture, it becomes very hard to be awed by the building. An apology sounds incomplete because you can tell the person is apologizing to smooth things over, not because they fully understand what they did. While everyone else seems to float along on the surface of interactions, enjoying the warmth of the moment, you are underwater, seeing the cold currents. The result is a particular kind of isolation. You can be surrounded by people who genuinely like you and still feel deeply alone, because nobody else appears to be processing reality at the same depth. This isolation deepens even further because your empathy never turns off. For most people, empathy is a skill they deploy in specific situations. But for you, empathy is not a switch. It is a constant passive absorption of other people's emotional energy. Because of a hyper-responsive mirror neuron system, you do not just intellectually note that a friend is grieving. You carry that grief in your chest for the rest of the week. You become a container. And by the end of a day filled with other people's stresses, you feel drained to the bone. You are just the sponge. And sponges eventually become heavy with everything they have absorbed while no one thinks to squeeze them out. Those absorbed emotions do not vanish. If they are not processed, they move into the physical body. Your brain receives a normal physical signal like a slight heart rate increase from a cup of coffee. It consults its historical database of danger and replies that a fast heartbeat equals panic. And suddenly, a non-event becomes a crisis. Your own body becomes an unreliable narrator constantly shouting emergency when there is only silence. If you recognize yourself in these patterns, your first instinct is probably to ask how you can turn this off. You cannot. Asking to turn off your hyper-awareness is like asking someone with perfect pitch to stop hearing when a note is flat. The goal is not to dim your perception. The goal is to stop carrying everything you perceive. And to do that, you have to make 3 psychological shifts. Shift number 1, learn that not every silence is a hidden message. Your brain is wired to fill in the blanks with survival scripts. If a friend takes hours to text back or a coworker's tone is cold, your mind drafts a worst-case scenario. The practice here is to question your interpretation. Ask yourself if this interpretation is a fact, or if it is your hypervigilance. Sometimes the cold tone is just a headache. Sometimes the silence is just silence. Shift number 2, and I warned you at the beginning of this video that this one would be the hardest to accept. Not every emotion that appears needs an action. When your sharp internal radar detects anxiety, your mind immediately wants to analyze it and solve it. But the most revolutionary act for the overly aware person is simply to observe the sensation without building a story around it. You notice the fast heartbeat and you say, that is a physical sensation. It is uncomfortable, but it is not dangerous. You let it become background noise. You stop turning a minor internal signal into a 5-alarm psychological fire. Shift number 3 is about how you show up for the rest of the world. Deep down, you already know that you are an emotional sponge. But here is the hard truth. Not every insight needs to be spoken. You can perceive a friend's hidden pain. You can detect the exact manipulation behind a colleague's flattery. And you can still choose to do absolutely nothing. You are not obligated to be the therapist for every person who radiates pain in your direction. You are allowed to witness it and then step back. That is not coldness. That is how you survive. When you make these shifts, your awareness does not disappear. It transforms. It moves from a frantic surveillance system to a deep, calm wisdom. You cannot turn the ceiling light of your mind completely off, but you can change its quality. You can soften it from a harsh operating room lamp that exposes every flaw into a warm, steady candle, a light bright enough to understand the beautiful fragility of being human and gentle enough to warm your own hands too. If you have spent your entire life feeling like your perception is your heaviest burden, I need you to hear me. You were never broken. You were just asked to be more attuned than the world around you could understand. If that candle metaphor brought you any peace today, leave a candle emoji in the comments. I want to see how many of us are out there. Send this to the person in your life who understands everyone else but feels completely unseen themselves. It might be the exact thing that finally helps them exhale. Subscribe to the channel because the next video explores a psychological trap that is even harder to spot. I will see you there.